On the morning of June 14, 2025, at precisely 9:23 a.m., the USS Princeton was cruising through what was supposed to be another routine freedom of navigation patrol in the ever-tense waters of the South China Sea. But routine ended when her spy radar caught something ominous. A Chinese Type 052D destroyer, which had been idling 200 kilometers away, suddenly surged to life, accelerating from 18 to 30 knots in less than 90 seconds. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the destroyer's captain had just received a direct order from Beijing: intercept the Americans and force them to back down. However, Beijing was about to receive a brutal reminder of why challenging the U.S. Navy in open water is a profoundly stupid idea. The Nimitz Carrier Strike Group, a floating fortress of American firepower, was doing what it had done for 75 years, keeping vital sea lanes open so the world's trade could flow, including China's own goods. They were 180 nautical miles from the nearest Chinese territory, well within international waters where $3.4 trillion in annual commerce passes through like clockwork. The strike group's mission was textbook: predictable courses, transparent intentions, and the kind of disciplined professionalism that distinguishes a real navy from a glorified maritime militia. By 9:26, the Princeton's radar team had fully classified the contact, no doubt about it, a Chinese Type 052D destroyer, with a threat level assessed as moderate to high. In the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer monitored the incoming vector of the Chinese warship with a comm forged by 122 vertical launch cells loaded with enough firepower to turn that destroyer into an artificial reef. The SBY radar's imaging was so clear they could practically count the rivets on the Chinese ship's hull. At its current speed, the Chinese destroyer would enter weapons engagement range in just 17 minutes. The math was terrifying for them. Their YJ-18 anti-ship missiles could close the remaining distance in under 4 minutes once launched. But the Princeton's SM-6 interceptors could reach out 240 nautical miles and slap those missiles out of the sky with ruthless precision. At 9:29, the Princeton's captain asked for an assessment of the Chinese ship's intent. The answer was obvious. At this trajectory and speed, the destroyer would be in firing range within 14 minutes. The recommended response was to go to general quarters. The captain, however, chose a different route, laced with quintessential American swagger. Let's see how badly they want to embarrass themselves first. And that was assuming they could even get close enough to try. The South China Sea was teeming with merchant vessels, 46 commercial ships within a 50-mile radius, all relying on the U.S. Navy's presence for safe passage. From a Singapore-flagged container ship loaded with semiconductors to a South Korean LNG tanker worth $200 million, countless livelihoods depended on this patrol. But Beijing seemed determined to escalate, perhaps believing that intimidation would force the Americans to blink. What they hadn't calculated was that the U.S. Navy hasn't lost a sea fight in over a century. At 9:30, the Princeton's cooperative engagement systems instantly shared threat data with every ship in the strike group. The Nimitz herself, 104,000 tons of floating American resolve, adjusted flight operations with mechanical precision. Destroyers Changhoon and Kidd repositioned to form a defensive screen that would turn any Chinese attack into a one-way suicide mission. Then, at 9:35, things escalated. An E-2D Hawkeye, orbiting at 25,000 feet and overseeing everything within a 400-mile radius, detected multiple aircraft launching from the Chinese carrier Shandong. Their radar profiles identified them as J-15 fighters, climbing aggressively and heading south as if they believed they stood a chance. But the U.S. air controllers noticed something almost comical. The J-15s were struggling to gain altitude, their fuel-limited ski jump launches forcing them to burn precious fuel in desperate climbs. Meanwhile, sonar operators aboard Princeton added another piece to this increasingly reckless Chinese maneuver. A submerged contact 80 nautical miles away, likely a Type 039 diesel-electric submarine. But this sub wasn't exactly stealthy. Its acoustic signature was so loud it could have been mistaken for a freight train. In a real conflict, this submarine wouldn't last 5 minutes. What China was attempting here wasn't a legitimate show of force. It was a clumsy intimidation campaign using outdated hardware. Their surface ships dated back to the 1990s, their carrier aircraft were underpowered antiques, and their submarines were so loud they could have been broadcasting their positions over AM radio. This was a classic case of bullying that only works if the target is weak or afraid. Unfortunately for Beijing, they had picked the wrong navy and the wrong ocean. By 9:37, the flight deck of the USS Nimitz transformed into a symphony of controlled chaos that only an American supercarrier can master. F divided by -18 Super Hornets from VFA-14 top hatters shot off the catapults every 45 seconds, executing a level of operational ballet that China's ski jump carriers could only dream of. The American jets, fully loaded with weapons and fuel, rocketed into the sky, while their Chinese counterparts were already burning through limited fuel reserves. The technological gap was laughable. American fighters and /APG 79 ASA radars could simultaneously track dozens of targets, while the J-15s, using outdated mechanically scanned radars, were essentially broadcasting their positions to everyone listening. Worse, every U.S. aircraft was linked in real time via Link 16, sharing sensor data instantaneously. The Chinese pilots, on the other hand, were relying on voice commands and outdated individual sensors, a networked gunfight where they were effectively blindfolded. Then came the electronic hammer. EA-18G Growlers entered the fight, armed with ALQ-99 jamming pods capable of scrambling enemy radar and communications from 100 miles away. The Chinese fighters found themselves fighting phantoms as American planes appeared, disappeared, and multiplied on their screens. Ghost contacts swarmed the radar as the U.S. executed a textbook wall formation. High cover at 35,000 feet, medium at 25,000, and low at 15,000, creating a kill box no Chinese aircraft could escape. Meanwhile, aboard a nearby RC-135 rivet joint, linguists were enjoying the spectacle. They intercepted Chinese pilots, desperately requesting permission for aggressive maneuvers, asking Beijing for clearance to buzz U.S. ships. The Americans found this procedural formality amusing. By the time Chinese high command approved anything, the tactical situation would have shifted a dozen times. But the Chinese weren't done making mistakes. At 9:47, the Chinese destroyer committed an act that in any other navy would have triggered immediate retaliation. It locked its fire control radar onto the USS Nimitz. In naval warfare, this is the equivalent of pointing a loaded gun at someone's head. Inside Princeton's Combat Information Center, the crew held firm. Fire control solutions were ready. The ship's 122 vertical launch cells were loaded and primed to vaporize the Chinese destroyer in seconds. Yet, the Americans maintained discipline. They let the lock persist for 30 seconds, long enough for the Chinese to claim they were ready to fire, but not long enough to trigger an American counterattack. It was a dangerous game of choreographed aggression, but the U.S. Navy wasn't about to flinch. Above, a Chinese J-15 pilot broke formation, diving toward an American Super Hornet in an aggressive thump maneuver. The U.S. pilot, a Top Gun graduate, responded by casually flipping inverted and pulling onto the Chinese fighter's 6 o'clock, achieving perfect firing position. His helmet display lit up the Chinese jet's engines in infrared, a perfect kill shot with an AM-9X Sidewinder. But once again, the trigger wasn't squeezed. Professional discipline trumped recklessness. Then came the submarine's final blunder. At 9:51, the Type 039 sub, creeping closer for hours, made a rookie mistake. It raised its snorkel to recharge batteries, making itself an easy target. The Princeton sonar had been tracking this sub for over an hour, cataloging its every move. If this had been a shooting war, the submarine captain would have had about 12 seconds to reflect on his life before an ASROC turned his boat into an underwater grave. By mid-afternoon, the Chinese forces found themselves trapped. Their destroyer to the west, the submarine to the southwest, and their carrier to the northwest, they were boxed in. At 2:30 p.m., the USS Nimitz made the final statement, launching everything that could fly, 48 aircraft, a breathtaking display of raw American air power. The sky darkened as growlers unleashed jamming havoc, scrambling Chinese radar into a blur of static and false contacts. Meanwhile, a Virginia-class submarine, which had been silently shadowing the Chinese formation for 8 days, surfaced 6 nautical miles from the Shandong, visible to the naked eye. The message was clear: we own this ocean. The psychological blow was devastating. The Chinese forces had failed to detect a 7,900-ton American submarine lurking beneath them for over a week. If this had been a real conflict, their carrier would have already been a smoldering wreck. The submarine surfaced for exactly 90 seconds, long enough to be seen, photographed, and reported, before slipping back into the depths. In the air, American Super Hornets continued their dominance, outmaneuvering and outlasting the fuel-starved Chinese fighters. One by one, the J-15s peeled off, returning to their carrier with near-empty tanks. By 4:23 p.m., the Shandong Strike Group had seen enough. They began their retreat, masked under the thin excuse of completed exercises. But everyone knew the truth. They had come to intimidate, to flex, to stake a claim. Instead, they got a front-row seat to a live demonstration of why the South China Sea remains America's 6th Great Lake.